Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. This episode is brought to you by L1 Automotive Training and Keith Perkins. If you're looking for education on module programming, J2534, EEPROM work, key and immobilizer, electrical diagnostics, or drivability diagnostics, Keith has a website, l1training.com, that's got over 60 hours of training videos on all those subjects and more. When I first started out doing mobile, I utilized Keith's videos on module programming in J2534 in order to get my head wrapped around what I would need for the tooling, the computers, the software setups, what kind of obstacles I would be up against when I'm out there programming modules on cars. And it was a huge benefit to me. And I continue to use the training videos that he has on his website. So I strongly recommend checking out l1training.com. The link is in the show notes. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping, and I will be your host once again for this week's episode. Just me this week. I'm going to do another informative, instructional episode on transmissions and transmission programming. I've done a couple of these before. I had one on the 8 and 10-speed GM transmissions. I had one on the Nissan Jatco CVTs. And it's just a quick audio guide to what you would need to know about this transmission, specifically for programming. I'm not going to go a whole lot into the diagnostics of it. Even for us, the diagnostics on these things aren't real heavy. Basically, our goal is to determine, is it inside or outside of the transmission, right? Is it computer electrical related, or is it in the transmission? If it's in the transmission, we're generally speaking not going much further in our role. You might be in your shop, depending on what you do, and maybe you're a transmission shop, and of course you're going in depth, but we're doing this for transmission shops a lot of the time, and I tell them, hey, you're the expert on the innards of this transmission. I haven't built a transmission since the 3T40 that I did in tech school. That transmission's from the early 90s. And although I understand, the inner workings, and I've done valve bodies and had them apart and stuff like that, you're the expert on the internals, right? And we're not set up for, pressure measurements and things like that. So where I'm going with this is I'm not going to focus real heavy on the diagnostics for this. This is mainly for programming of these transmissions. And depending on your role, you might be in a shop and doing the actual repair of the transmission, which will make some of this easier because you'll know where you're at. But I know there's a lot of mobile programmers that listen to this show, and maybe the vehicle's coming from another shop to your shop because you have programming capabilities. So you kind of be in the same boat there. What are some things that you need to know going into it? What are some tips? What are some things to consider and some pitfalls that you might encounter along the way? So again, just to be clear what we're talking about today, this is the 9-speed transmission that's made by ZF. It's a German company. They make a ton of the transmissions that you deal with in multiple vehicles, all kinds of European stuff, but then also like all of the Ford and GM 6-speed transmissions are made by ZF. This 9-speed is also made by ZF. And where you're going to see this, and my main focus today is going to be on Jeep and Chrysler vehicles. I will note that they are in Honda and Acura vehicles, like a Pilot, an Odyssey, and a couple others. And they're in Jaguar Land Rover in a couple models. Now, for Jaguar Land Rover, I'm not really going to talk about it. I haven't dealt with any personally. I know that those modules can be cloned, and I'll talk more about the module specific because the physical unit, if you look at the module for all of these, regardless of the vehicle brand that they're in, they all look the same. It's the same physical module. How the software is going to be set up is definitely going to change, though. Again, I haven't dealt with any Jaguar Land Rover. Not going to talk about that today. I will make one note on the Honda Acura side of things, because this is very different than the Jeep Chrysler application of basically the same transmission and the same module. But the way that Honda and Acura does it in the models that I've worked with, and this is important to know, is that the immobilizer is tied in with the TCM. Okay. So if either the TCM or the transmission and TCM are replaced as a unit, again, I'll talk more details about the module here as we go, then you have to perform an immobilizer function, or you're not even going to be able to key that thing up. And I dealt with this on a Honda Pilot, and it was the first one that I'd run into, and it's not really straightforward. I will say that the Autel IM series is capable, but it's not intuitive. So it takes a little bit of work to get there. It's not just straight up like link TCM to the immobilizer. It's a very different path for that, but it is capable. You can also use the Honda immobilizer tool. I struggled with that as well. That is broken in some instances and takes some work to get it working right, but it is possible. And then they'll need programming. But again, my focus today is not on the Honda Acura side of things. If you got questions on the immobilizer, I don't know, hit me up. I'll see if I can walk you through it. But I want to focus more on the details of the Jeep and Chrysler versions of this 9-speed ZF transmission, because that's what we see the majority of. And there's a lot to consider when you go into programming. I think they have the most steps that you could have with this combination compared to some of the other brands. I guess maybe I shouldn't say that because I haven't done Jaguar, but I am pretty experienced with the Jeep Chrysler. So this 9-speed transmission, you're going to see this used in the Cherokee, in the Compass, in the Renegade, in the Pacifica, and the 200. And there might be other models, but those were the ones that I could think of that I've seen this 9-speed transmission used in. So they have problems. They get replaced. There's a bunch of TSBs. There's software updates and stuff, but there's also mechanical failures of these things. We see them failed quite often. And when they get replaced, there is going to be some type of programming or scan tool function that you need to run in order for everything to be set up correctly and for that vehicle to go down the road and shift correctly. So that's where the focus of this is going to be today. Again, just a quick guide of what you might need to do or know going into that situation. And this probably isn't all encompassing, so just bear in mind, read service information and check, because your unique circumstance or vehicle might have some extra step that I'm not mentioning here. But this is just a free audio guide, so bear that in mind as we continue. But again, we've done lots of these, so I'm going to give you some advice here. So one thing to know, and you may already know this, but if you haven't dealt with it, is that the transmission control module for these transmissions is mounted to the top of the transmission, but it is external. And so a lot of the ZF transmissions that we see, the transmission control module is inside of the transmission, right behind a cover. Maybe it's part of a valve body or a TECM unit that has solenoids attached to it, but you have to take apart the transmission in order to change the module. And then there's, obviously transmissions where the transmission control module is external, but it's mounted up on the firewall or under the dash or somewhere else on the vehicle. So really external from the vehicle. This one's unique as the transmission control module is actually bolted to the top of the transmission. So while it's not the easiest thing to do in the car, you could still remove it. But when it's out of the vehicle, like that thing is right there and it's easy to remove or swap. Now, here's why I bring this up, and here's why this is important to know. Because if a transmission is getting installed, and particularly in this case, a used transmission, but there's theoretically this could be the case with a new transmission as well. But with a used transmission, you need to know as the programmer going into the situation, did they swap the original TCM onto the new or used transmission, or is the TCM that is bolted to it the one that came with the transmission? Now, again, usually if the TCM is inside of the transmission, you don't have to really consider that. Odds are they didn't take the used transmission apart and the original apart and swap the TECM. I'm referring to GM terminology there. But That generally doesn't happen. It could, obviously, but most of the time that does not happen. But with these, because it's external and it just really depends on the technicians or the shop's mindset of how they're doing things, they could easily swap that control module, put the original on the used one and bolt it up, and they'd be ready to go. Maybe not quite. You do have to do some other steps. It is important, even if you do swap that module. And that might be the intent, right, of the technician. I've had that. I've had people say, well, I swapped the module. We shouldn't need to program anything. Yes and no. It's going to change the steps that you need to do, but you still are going to have to do some form of programming. So let me break this down for you in the different scenarios. Actually, you know what I'll do first is I'll walk you through everything that could potentially need to be done on one of these transmissions. Like all of the functions that you might have to run. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the different scenarios that you might run into as you're working on these things. So when you're programming these TCMs, number one, they do have the VIN written to them for the vehicle. So obviously, whatever VIN number is on the vehicle, you want that written to the TCM. And if you get a used module, it's already going to have a VIN written to it. You have to rewrite it. I've been able to do that on these used modules without much issue. You're also going to have the software, the actual programming for the TCM. Now, if it's a new module, you're going to be putting the initial software into that vehicle using YTech most likely. And that's going to pertain to that specific vehicle, the software level, and the configuration of that vehicle, the options that were built on that Cherokee or that Renegade. Is it all-wheel drive or is it four-wheel drive? Does it have this gear or this final drive ratio or this one? Is it a Trailhawk or is it not? Right? These are all the things that will change that software application. And I have found with these 9-speeds, there's a ton of different options, especially like the Jeep Cherokee. There seems to be like 8 different options for each vehicle. And so getting the wrong software on a used module is very possible. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go. But so we got VIN right, we got software, the actual programming. There's also a valve body learn. Okay. So this is a link between the transmission control module, which again is mounted external to the transmission, and the electrical portion of the valve body, which is the solenoids. And it is a process where that TCM will learn the electrical characteristics and in turn some of the flow rates, you could say, or the physical characteristics of the solenoids that are applied in that specific transmission. Now, I looked, and there's nothing in service information that really explains what they're doing here in this learn. And I looked externally on, the internet to see if I could find any resources, transmission magazines and things like that for an explanation of what's happening during that valve body learn. And it does not appear that they release this information so you can see exactly what's going on. So I can't give you a real definitive answer, but my best guess is it's doing some sort of electrical, either resistance or current test in order to determine the characteristics of each one of the solenoids. Now, what I was initially thinking was that the valve body in this had some sort of ROM chip with stored data about the characteristics of that valve body. The reason I was initially thinking this is because if you go to the Nissan CVTs, the Jatco, some of them have that used in the Versa and the Sentra. When you go to do the valve body learn, there's no QR code on these Nissans. It grabs the information from this ROM chip and it learns it into the TCM. And that was applied to a few other CVTs as well, even in Dodge and Chrysler vehicles like the Avengers and stuff like that. But I was thinking that that's what happened on this one. It doesn't appear to be that way, because if you look at the wiring diagram, there's no such thing that exists. If you look at the part itself, like the valve body itself and the sub harness that's in the transmission, no such thing exists. So my guess is that the TCM is learning some sort of electrical characteristic of this, but it could also be looking at pressures and clutch applications and things of that nature as well during this learn. So I don't have the exact definition, but here's what I can tell you. It's important not only for the operation of the transmission, right? The TCM should know these characteristics about the valve body in order to shift it correctly. But if it's a new TCM and you forget to do this, or you didn't even know you had to do this because you didn't read service information or you didn't listen to this podcast, it will have a configuration code. And this, unless you read the details of this code, it's a little confusing because there's a bunch of other processes. I'm not even done with all the processes, and you might think it's one of the other ones. Like, hey, I did all of these other steps, but you missed the valve body learn. So there's a valve body learn. It links the TCM to the valve body on that specific transmission. And because, again, that TCM is external on top of the transmission, it's easy to get them swapped around, and then they're no longer linked. So you want to make sure you perform that outside of maybe one circumstance. This show is brought to you by Automotive Seminars. If you're looking to stay up on the cutting edge diagnostic strategies and techniques, this is the place. You've got live 4-hour seminars that are put online that you can join in, ask questions, interact with the instructors, with some of the best of the best. They've got Keith Perkins and John Thornton putting on classes like network diagnostics, mechanical engine testing, advanced electrical testing, and GDI diagnostics, and a ton more. And once you purchase one of these training seminars, you can access this at any time that you want through your account at automotiveseminars.com. You can rewatch the training a year, 2 years later, which makes this training even more valuable. So I highly recommend you check this out. The link is in the show notes. There's also a proxy alignment. Now, this again is applying specifically to these Chrysler Jeep vehicles and specifically to the Fiat architecture vehicles. So the Pacifica doesn't fall under that category. And I could probably do a whole other podcast, or maybe I have. I've talked about proxy learns before. I think there was an episode with a ProMaster City that I talked about the proxy learn in depth. But essentially what's happening there is the BCM stores the vehicle configuration that's downloaded from the Chrysler server, and then it distributes it to the rest of the control modules that need that configuration information. And that BCM is essentially telling all of these modules, hey, you're set up on this vehicle with these options. It's coding, really, because I've seen some of the stuff in the module and it's just turning on and off different options and telling it like, hey, you have this gear ratio. Hey, you're set up for 4-wheel drive, not all-wheel drive. Again, the software can correlate to that, but the proxy learn is more along the lines of coding of the module. Again, that only applies to the Fiat architecture. If it's not a Fiat architecture, it won't have a proxy learn option. You can't even do it. But if it does, you'll need to run this proxy learn. Again, you'll have a code in the TCM and maybe other modules as well. If this wasn't performed, there'll be it's a configuration code, kind of like the one I was talking about with the valve body learn, but it's a different code. Again, you read the details of the code, it'll tell you what to do. One thing on these proxy learns. Now, if you're doing all this programming, you probably have YTech, and so it doesn't really matter, but this might be helpful for other cars. You can run a proxy learn on one of these Fiat architecture vehicles with just a regular scan tool. I know TopDon, I know Autel, and I think even Snap-on will do these under the special functions of the BCM. It's not an online function. Again, it is taking the configuration that was already downloaded to the BCM body control and in distributing it out or aligning the modules on the vehicle that also share that configuration. And again, scan tool function, Really easy to do. Most shops don't realize that. They'll call us for these proxy learns. They have the tool that will do it. So if you didn't know that, you know that now, and you can use that to make some money, hopefully. Finally, there's a quick learn. This has been around for a long time on a lot of Chrysler transmission applications, and this is just going to be learning clutch volumes and helping the TCM learn the specifics of the transmission itself. So this is beyond the valve body, if you will. Of course, the valve body is involved with this, but this is really like the actual like clutch packs and, you know, gears being applied, and it's learning different characteristics of the transmission here. You've probably done a quick learn or two if you've worked on any Chrysler vehicle over the last 30 years. I mean, they had this all the way back into the early 2000s on scan tools. Some of them take longer than others. One thing I will say about these 9-speeds is you have to have them up to temperature, which can take a little bit of time. So that's where this might be a little time consuming, but those are all the different functions that you might need to run on one of these TCMs or transmissions, or both if they've been replaced. So again, that's VinRight, that's software, that's, you know, the actual programming. There's a valve body learn, there's a proxy alignment, and there's a quick learn. So that's why I'm talking about this, because it's actually kind of confusing. Yeah, you can read service information, you can go through it, but let me go a little bit deeper here on these functions as far as what you would need to do and when. Okay, because you might be in different scenarios. Are you replacing just the transmission? Are you replacing the transmission and the TCM? Are you doing a new TCM? Are you doing a used TCM? Did they put a used transmission in the car but swap the original TCM onto that transmission before they installed it? Okay, what do you do there? I have a little chart for our guys here to know the scenario. So you obviously want to ask the customer, you know, what was done, what was changed, what's installed, where did things get swapped around, this and that. And you can tell from the scan tool a lot of times in a used situation whether the TCM is original to the vehicle or not. Just look at the VIN number. If the VIN number is already correct for the vehicle, that's probably the original TCM. If it's not, it's going to be the used one. Now, of course, if it's new, then we're just, you know, setting it up for the first time. So again, if you're replacing a new transmission, it's going to come with a new TCM, most likely. I haven't seen a scenario where that's not the case. So then you're going to be doing all of those functions that I talked about: VinRight, software, valve body learn, proxy learn, quick learn. And maybe not even necessarily in that order. I probably should be reading them off in order. You may have to do the software first, and then you could do VinRight, then you can do a proxy learn, then you can do a valve body learn, then you do a quick learn. I think that's the order that I would do it in, but you can figure that out as you go. If you're replacing just the TCM, right, a new TCM, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to have to do all of this because that module is essentially going to be blank. Now, what if we put a used transmission in the vehicle and it has a used TCM that they never took off? It came with that transmission. What functions do you need to do in that case? Now, you're going to have to do the VinRight. For sure. You got to change that VIN number so that matches the vehicle. And again, if you're using YTech, I haven't had an issue changing the VIN number using YTech. You might even be able to do it with aftermarket scan tools as well. One thing I should mention on these used TCMs, there is software and tools out there that will clone these on the bench, but I think you have to open them up. I haven't done it myself, but I've seen multiple tools offer the ability to clone these 9-speed transmissions one-to-one, plug and play. They'll have everything from the original TCM. So there's stuff out there if you're interested to go that route. The reason I bring that up is the next thing that you would need to do with a used transmission is to verify that the software that is already in that used TCM matches the vehicle's options. Now, or I should say, is the software that is supposed to be in that vehicle, which will pertain to the vehicle options. This is where we usually see issues as far as a used transmission and TCM being installed in one of these vehicles, is that they'll get the correct transmission, which has the correct TCM. And it is important to check the hardware too. We have seen that as well. A shop will just throw a used TCM on a vehicle and it's out of something completely wrong. So the hardware is incorrect. So the hardware's got to be right. So let's just assume that they got the correct hardware for the transmission, the TCM. We still have to correct the software potentially. Now you can use the Fed World Report. If you Google that, it's all the Chrysler flash files for like every Chrysler vehicle since 1998 for PCM and TCM. So engine control and transmission control. It'll have all of the software numbers, and I could, again, do probably a whole podcast. I think I actually put a video in the Facebook group a few years ago on how to do this, but you can use some Control F action within the big PDF, and you can figure out if the software that is in there is correct for your vehicle, or you can figure out what software is correct for the vehicle that you have. Now, if you have the old TCM, you can also use that. And that's probably the simplest way in a lot of cases, is to check the old TCM, the original. Okay, what software is in there? That's the software I want in this one. Does it match? No. Okay, then you're going to have to consider how do I change this if I can? Now, again, like I said, there's tools out there that will clone these modules. That would take care of it. That would transfer that software. YTech is generally not going to do this if it's wrong, right? YTech will update your software, right? It'll go up in the level, but you can't go left and right. You can't put in a different software into that module using YTech under the normal functions. Now, there is a way to do this with the J version of Chrysler programming. There's also some softwares out there that will do this. I'm not going to mention them on here because they're kind of in that gray area of is this a legitimate legal option that people should be using? That's a question mark. So if you're interested, I'm sure you can go onto Google, you can figure it out. But there is software that will change the programming that's in there to the level that you want. But you also might just be in the situation where, hey, this isn't the right module. You need to get it out of a Jeep with these specifics. Now, finding out what specifics you have. Let's say the original's gone. You're like, okay, I don't know what the original software is. You could use that Fed World Report, but the Fed World Report only works for you if you know the specifics about that vehicle, right? Like final drive ratio, like all-wheel drive versus four-wheel drive. There's a number of other applications that you need to know about that vehicle. RepairLinkShop.com is usually what I use to do that. So I'll put in the VIN of the vehicle. I'll reference it against that sheet. It takes a little bit of legwork to figure out, but we can figure out what software is supposed to be in that vehicle. And then we will find out if the one that is in there is correct. So that piece of it can actually take a little bit of time if somebody's putting in a used transmission. So that's definitely a stumbling block and something I wanted to bring up, because if it doesn't have the right programming in there, you can get weird codes not only in the TCM but in other modules when that TCM is expecting a drivetrain control module, but one doesn't exist on the vehicle because it wasn't set up with that configuration. And you'll never get rid of that code until you get the correct software in that module. All right. So again, used transmission, the used TCM that came with it on there. We got to do that VIN right. We got to do the software. Now, for the valve body and the quick learn, in my personal opinion, in this situation with a used transmission and TCM installed together, I don't think you necessarily need to do these. I would say they're optional. And the reason being is that TCM should already know the characteristics of that valve body and that transmission, right? If it's been driven. Now, I'm not saying you can't do these. And if you want to do a proper service, make sure that it's set up correctly for the customer because you just installed this transmission. Go ahead and do it. But I don't think it's 100% necessary. Maybe you could go drive it. If it shifts funny, okay, let's run it through these processes and see, does this, help at all? But theoretically, that TCM should already know the characteristics of the valve body. It should already know the characteristics of the transmission because they came together. So that's my opinion on that. You may have to do that proxy alignment as well, though, with a used one because I would say you're almost going to have to if it's a Fiat architecture and you're putting on a used TCM, because it will not be aligned to that vehicle. So used transmission and used TCM, you can do VIN right, software programming, proxy alignment, valve body and quick learn are optional in my opinion in that scenario. All right, then finally, we've got this scenario, and I've run into this. Used transmission is installed, but they swapped the original TCM onto it. Okay, what do you need to do in this? Now, you don't need to do the VIN. You don't need to do software. You don't need to do the proxy learn here. You for sure need to run the valve body learn and the quick learn here, because now that TCM, your original to the car TCM, has a well, I shouldn't say brand new. Maybe it's a used one. That's usually the scenario, but it's a new transmission in reference to what that TCM has stored for data. So you need to run that valve body learn. You need to run that quick learn. Okay. Now you can check for software updates here in any of these circumstances. If you've got a used one, definitely look to see if there's an update, because they did correct a lot of things. There was a TSB for the Cherokees where they didn't even have a quick learn option until you did the update. And also bear in mind, specifically on those Cherokees for a few years, there was an update where you needed to update both the PCM and the TCM at the same time. And I don't think it was a sequential function, if I remember. I think it's just there's a note saying like, hey, you need to do this module too if you update this one to the most current level. So pay attention to that. You'll be using YTech for that one. All right, so hopefully all that made sense, and hopefully that's helpful information if you run into one of these 9-speed transmissions, and you probably will because they seem to fail quite often. But thought I'd give a little bit of information for everybody. Otherwise, just want to say thank you to everybody for listening, all the feedback you get on the show. Always appreciate that. We'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.